Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Shvius, chapter 10, Halacha 1. This is the second part of the Shir. Today we're going to be covering Ketubot, and it's interesting because we were talking about that yesterday with Rabbi Yosei, what happens where you have land that is going to be a guarantee of a ketubah, and the husband, even with the assent of the wife, goes and has a sale. Question is, over there, is that ketubah requirement for that specific piece of land going to survive after the sale? In other words, the land is sold, but here you have this particular piece of land. It's written in the ketubah. Is that still going to be attached to the land? Is the woman, in the case of a death or divorce, going to be able to go seize this land and collect from it? And that's what we were covering at the end of yesterday. Now, today we have a slightly different topic on it. It's actually very interesting. Here's another question that comes up with Shvius. So, Shvius comes, and now you have the ketubah payment. Is a ketubah payment really going to be like a loan? Well, in certain ways, it can be, and here's how it goes. So the Gemara says, Rav says that a ketubah payment becomes subject to cancellation by Shvius if the wife merely accepted partial payment of the ketubah, even though she did not establish the balance on her ex-husband or his estate as a loan. And the Gemara finishes and says, if she established the entire ketubah as a loan, even though she did not accept partial payment. So that's a second way it can be. Either one, it could be where she accepts a partial payment of the ketubah, or she actually establishes the entire ketubah as a loan. And this is a case where she doesn't take the partial payment. So Rav is talking about two cases here. And we were talking about other kinds of obligations if they're going to be wiped out in the Shvius year. One of those obligations that we talked about from the Mishnah is in the case of a woman who is raped or a defamed woman. The Torah gives those women a generous amount of money. And, is that going to be something that's wiped out? The answer is no. What about a ketubah, though? Can a ketubah become a debt instrument where it becomes like a loan? So, according to Rav is basically saying that once a ketubah becomes due and have to pay, and there's two ways that happens: either the husband dies or there's a divorce. And then what happens is it can actually get converted over to a normal loan in one of two ways, and then ultimately get wiped out in Shvius, according to Rav. So the first way is that a woman agrees to convert the entire ketubah debt into a loan, or with the acceptance of a partial payment of the ketubah debt, the balance of the ketubah is automatically going to be established as a loan, says the Mara Fulda, and that's what's going to cause it to get wiped out. Now, with regards to wages or shop credit, that's going to be something a little bit different. That's going to be where, according to Rav, a partial payment for any of those debts would also automatically establish balance of that as a loan, and that also would wipe it out in Shvius. So you have to be careful on worker payments, because if the worker takes part of the payment for his wages and basically he accepts part of the payment, he's effectively turned it into a loan, says Rav, and then it becomes subject to where it could be wiped out in Shvius. So the Gemara is going to give a dissenting view to this opinion. Rabbi Chia teaches in a Baraisa, the ketubah does not become subject to the law of Shvius unless the wife both accepts a partial payment of the ketubah and also establishes the balance as a loan. So Rabbi Chia, who is dissenting, is holding that in order for the ketubah to be established as a loan, there have to be two conditions that are met. One is that the woman has to take partial payment, And also, she has to convert the balance into a remaining loan. And at that point, the debt is no longer a ketubah debt, and therefore it's going to be subject to shvius cancellation. Now, Rav in Bavli Gittin 18a is actually going to subscribe to this view. So apparently, from what we see over there in Bavli Gittin 18a, after Rav heard Rabbi Chia's argument, Rav retracted his ruling and changed his ruling to rule in accordance with Rabbi Chia. So actually, in this text here, the Vilna Gaon actually amends the text a little bit to conform with Rav's view in the Bavli. But as the Mara Fuld is noting here, that actually Rav had this as an original thing and then changed his mind to Rabbi Chia's point of view. So that really Rabbi Chia's point of view is pretty novel. It's deep. Really what he's saying is this is not a normal kind of debt. And so even if you've accepted part of it, this debt still survives shvius because it's a ketubah debt. It's not a loan. And you've taken on this obligation when you went and you purchased your wife and you gave her a ketubah. And that's not really a loan. And so when you paid part of it off, if she didn't convert it over to a loan, then all it is just a ketubah debt. And that's not you borrowing the money. So Rav actually goes and agrees with that. And that's a deeper insight. And so sometimes it's important to see some of the opinions and then see how, sometimes someone can actually change their mind. And then we learn from that. The Gemara now is going to talk about another part of the Mishnah. We're going to talk about what Rabbi Yudah says about previous obligations being canceled. So the Gemara asks a question and says, because the shopkeeper extended credit to him a second time, does the first obligation become a loan? The Gemara is asking a question. Basically, it's saying that so the Mishnah comes along and it rules that shvius does not cancel shop credit. And why? Because it did not originate from a loan. But the Mishnah now is stating that shvius will cancel a debt owed to someone who sold meat on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So what the Gemara is going to try to go through and reconcile is that if it turns out that that day was actually the last day of the previous year, then the sale took place before the end of shvius. So the question is, how do we reconcile this ruling with the previous ruling regarding money owed to a shopkeeper? Because, again, now it's like you really just owe money to a shopkeeper for this meat. And the Gemara is going to say that there's actually no contradiction between these two cases where you extended money over to a loan or you went out to the butcher on, one day before Rosh Hashanah and you got a piece of meat and you didn't pay money, you basically borrowed based on your credit to go and do it. What's going to be the difference? Rabbi Lazar says in this Gemara, the ruling regarding meat distributed on Rosh Hashanah is following the view of Rabbi Yudah, and that's going to be talking about where after selling the meat, the seller sold something else to the buyers of the meat on the last day of the shvius year. So the original debt for the purchase of the meat is now going to be transformed into a loan. And that would be the case with shop credit, where Rabbi Yudah is holding that each subsequent purchase on credit transforms the previous obligation into a loan. So what this is saying, like, let's say you have the shopkeeper goes and he gets a second inventory loan. And he gets a second letter of credit on new inventory. What Rabbi Yudah is saying, well, basically what happened was the business or even the lender basically converted this first note over into a regular loan. And the second, the newest extension of credit is only to this inventory. So that's a nuance and a subtlety that we might not have gotten. So we might have thought, well, wait a second. Okay, you're taking out another loan, and it's also for shop credit. And what about the first one? We would have thought that, well, that's for shop credit, and this one's for shop credit, and that's for inventory, and this one's for inventory. Not so with what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, the first one automatically transforms into a loan that has to get repaid, and it can get wiped out in Shvius. And the second one is going to be contingent on the inventory. And so over here, where and by the way, the question is, why exactly is it that the conversion of the earliest loan obligation is going to get converted into a loan, and that's going to get subjected to cancellation by Shvius? Now, Shvius should not cancel the debt for meat purchase, because you would say, wait a second, but maybe this meat purchase is really the same as, just, an inventory loan. And we see that these inventory loans don't get wiped out. And, so why would this one get wiped out and the regular inventory loan on the store not get wiped out? So the Gemara is going to try to dig into getting the answer to this. And it says, but is it fit for one who sold the meat to demand payment from the buyer in Rosh Hashanah? Certainly not. So the idea is that since someone may not demand payment on Rosh Hashanah, the Shvius prohibition against demanding payment does not apply on Rosh Hashanah, and any debt created that day should not be canceled. That's going to be the question that's being asked. And, we know that in the Torah, in Devarim 15:2, it says, and this is the matter of the relinquishment. Every creditor shall relinquish that which he has claim on his fellow. He shall not press his fellow or brother for payment. So the juxtaposition here of the prohibition, he shall not press, and that's going to be with the command of relinquish. That's going to link the two together, indicating that the command to relinquish applies only where there's the prohibition of he shall not press, and that's also an effect. So the Gemara is going to answer this and resolve it. And Rabbi Ba says, in the name of Rabbi Zera, since the buyer is fit for the seller to trust, this is going to be because, hey, the butcher gives the meat on credit, and it might not even be written down anywhere. It's just, hey, okay, come back and pay later. So it's going to be considered as if it is fit for the seller to demand payment for him. Therefore, even on Yom Tov, the debt would be subject to the Shvius prohibition of not to press for payment, and it is thus possible for Shvius to cancel such a debt. So the reason that the person does not normally trust another unless he can eventually demand payment for him is because you might not be able to collect. But part of this with the butcher is that there's a thing of trust, and it's such a small amount of money compared to inventory for a shop, like to go and stock a shop to be a storekeeper, that the amount of money is not enough, and you're basically not worried about pressing for repayment. The other case, it's a large amount of money, and you are going to be pressing for payment because you're receiving collateral. They're receiving, it's based on the inventory, and it's basically a sizable amount of money. And in the other case, it's such a small amount of money, and it's relatively trivial, a small amount of meat, and it's based on trust, and there's no documentation, that debt over there is basically transformed into a loan. And the other one is substantial enough where it's not automatically transformed into a loan, unless there's, as Rabbi Yehuda points out, a second loan arrangement like this. And in that case, the second one will still be a loan that's based on store inventory, and the first loan that was originally there will be converted into a regular loan, and that can be wiped out. So it's very important for you to know this, because if you're a lender or a borrower, it can impact the way you're going to arrange this, and you might end up in a dispute where it could go to a bet din, and the way you do it, you have to be very careful. I myself lent 400 shekels to a student at the yeshiva for a new phone, and he just changed yeshivas, forgot about it, changed his phone number, and that loan is coming up and will be wiped out in Shvius because I can't get a hold of him. So, I'm not going to be allowed to press it. And you say, oh, well, chaval, you lose your money. Actually, that's not true. There's always a goal to try to aim to do every mitzvah in the Torah. And I say, wow, that's great. I get to do this mitzvah of you shall not press, and how you treat the loan after Shvius comes, where it's wiped out. And so for me to be a lender and actually treat it this way is a big mitzvah, and I get benefit in Hashem, in Shemayim, by actually observing this, and not a lot of people get to experience this. So actually I get good mitzvah points for that. Now, having explained how debt that can be incurred on a festival or Yom Tov can be canceled, the Gemara is going to get into something with Rabbi Yehuda on how debt for purchase will be transformed into a loan when more credit is extended later on. So this is getting into this idea of, okay, you have a first loan and it's on inventory. Now you've taken out the second loan, and now this second loan is on inventory. The first one gets converted. How does this all work? Here's how. Gemara says, and since it is fit for the seller to demand payment from the buyer, it is considered as if it is fit for the buyer to give the seller payment for the first purchase when he is extended credit for a new purchase. And when the seller provides him with additional merchandise, even later that day, in the case of a smaller shopkeeper, despite the fact that he still owed the meat, there's a mutual understanding implicit in there that the debt for the first meat is transformed into a loan. And Rabbi Yehuda's view about this is saying, so too here, where the shopkeeper extends credit a second time to the same buyer, since it was fit for the buyer to give him money for the earlier purchase, and he did not give it, the obligation for the first purchase becomes a loan. And the Mishnah states that Rabbi Yossi says, any obligation for work that ceases on Shvius is canceled, in dispute with the Tanna Kama, who held that wages are never canceled unless they are established as a loan. So the sages are saying that if you owe money for work, that unless it gets transformed over into a loan, the work obligation to pay your wages survives, not according to Rabbi Yossi. Let's look at Rabbi Yossi's view. The Gemara is going to have a back and forth between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish on trying to understand the minority view here of Rabbi Yossi. We know that in a debate between the sages and Rabbi Yossi, the opinion is going to be, the halacha is going to be by the sages, but we still want to understand Rabbi Yossi's opinion. So Rabbi Yochanan says that Rabbi Yossi is referring to where the worker was hired for work like plowing, where he was required to cease work because it is forbidden to plow on Shvius. So this is a note where Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the Mishnah is basically saying about Rabbi Yossi's view that work that must end on Shvius because of Shvius restrictions like plowing, at that point the work is considered complete and the wages owed are considered a loan and then going to be subject to Shvius cancellation. But if the worker was involved in work that could continue during Shvius, the money owed until that point does not become a loan, and Shvius will not cancel it. Now, the Vilna Gaon is going to explain about this, that the basis for the distinction is as follows. If the worker was engaged in work that is forbidden on Shvius, we can assume that his work has ended when Shvius begins, and he's now owed the wages. But if he was engaged in work that is permitted on Shvius, even though he happened to finish that specific job, it is always possible that he will be asked to continue. And although he legally has the right to demand payment when he completes the job, nevertheless, the worker does not consider his work done and the payment due unless no additional work is available. This, by the way, is very much the same as a storekeeper extending credit a second time. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan is coming along and saying, look, you have work that can get transformed into a loan because you have a work obligation and it's supposed to finish even allowed work, okay? And now you didn't just demand payment. You continue to do some extra work to add on to the amount that you're owed. And so effectively it's the same thing. He's saying that, look, the first amount of money that you had, that you were owed, effectively turns into a loan. And the second amount of money is effectively for this, extra work that you did during Shvius, that by the way is going to be permitted work, is effectively going to be like you extending a new worker obligation, a work payment obligation, which is like a storekeeper loan. And so that's why the first one is going to be wiped out. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Actually, these two things are next to each other, and these two things are actually very related because the mechanism is working the same way. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is now going to explain Rabbi Yossi's opinion about someone who's going to hire for a type of work. Again, Rabbi Yossi's opinion here is not the halacha, but we want to understand what's going on. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says that Rabbi Yossi is referring to a higher type of work like construction, where the work happened to be completed on Shvius. And the idea that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is going to be saying is that any work that happens to be completed on Shvius is going to be included in Rabbi Yossi's ruling, canceling wages for work that ceased on Shvius. Why? Because wages are not due until the completion of work. And if the work is completed during Shvius, the wages will become due at the time and canceled by Shvius. But if the work is not completed until after Shvius, the wages are not yet due when Shvius would cancel the debt, and therefore Shvius wouldn't cancel it. Part of what Rish Lakish is saying is he's saying that if the work carries over into Shvius, then being owed money in Shvius itself is not going to cancel it. And if you ended the work just before Shvius, automatically this is going to be converted into a loan, according to Rish Lakish. The Gemara is going to explain how each view is going to understand the words of Rabbi Yossi. And in Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, Shvius is going to cancel only an obligation for work that ceases on account of Shvius, as is implicated by Rabbi Yossi's word, where it says any obligation to work that ceases in Shvius. And that's basically going to be saying, okay, so now if you did extra work that is even permitted during the Shvius year, this is effectively going to be turning this, erasing this worker debt obligation, turning it into a regular loan because you've created a new one. And then in Shimon ben Lakish's opinion, Rabbi Yossi means that any work that ceases on its own, not because of the Shvius restrictions. So in the Mishnah, it's going to be stating, according to the Pnei Moshe, that Shvius, as to explain this opinion by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the Pnei Moshe explains that the Shvius cancels the obligation for work that ceases during Shvius, and that means that the work concluded in the year of Shvius, and that is not referring to the Shvius prohibition. So the Gemara is going to explore Rabbi Yossi's opinion further, and the question is Rabbi Yossi stating the ruling in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rabbi Yossi said that the wages for any work that cease in Shvius are canceled. but the wages for work that does not cease in Shvius are not canceled. So this appears to be consistent with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, who's maintaining that with regards to store credit, that when the storekeeper does not demand payment for the earlier obligation and then creates new obligations for basically like new credit, okay, he issues a second note and he doesn't demand repayment for the first one. Basically, the first one is going to get converted into a loan. And so too, Rabbi Yossi's point is going to be that if the worker did not demand the wages when he completed the work, then the money due to him is converted into a loan. And that's going to make it canceled by Shvius. And the Gemara accepts this. The Gemara is basically going to be agreeing that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, who dispute the Tanakhama's position that an obligation due from wages or from store credit is not going to be converted into a loan unless the debt is formally established as a loan. And the formulation by Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi is holding that there are other ways to convert it into a debt or into a loan. And the Gemara is going to address whether Rabbi Yehuda's position is consistent with Rabbi Yossi's opinion, and it says that, however, Rabbi Yehuda is not stating his ruling in accordance with Rabbi Yossi. So even though Rabbi Yehuda holds that the store credit becomes converted into a loan only when further credit's extended, regarding the worker's wages, he does not require the laborer to have completed his work, but Rabbi Yossi does. And that's going to be the mechanism, according to Rabbi Yossi, for why the wages are going to be turned into a loan. Rabbi Yossi is working on the same principle that Rabbi Yehuda is, but Rabbi Yehuda is not necessarily working on the same principle Rabbi Yossi is. Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying that you don't have to finish, and Rabbi Yossi is basically saying no, that he had to finish the work, and that's part of the condition. Now, the Gemara is going to reject that, and it's going to say that even though Rabbi Yehuda said in the Mishnah it is not in the manner of the money changer to give an Isser, this, by the way, is going to be a silver coin to a customer until he takes the dinar from him. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda concedes concerning the pay of a hired worker that it is only due at the end when the work is completed. Thus, only if the work has been completed will the obligation become canceled through Shvius. So over here, this is regarding a money changer that Rabbi Yehuda holds that this opinion is there, but regarding a laborer, he's going to concede that the wages are due only when the work is completed, and he can agree with Rabbi Yossi's ruling that Shvius canceled wages only when the work is completed. Anyway, I got to go feed the baby, and have a great day.